Welcome, everybody. I want to first just mention an experience I had this morning over at the University of Chicago Laboratory Schools. Robin Appleby, the director, and her staff put together a phenomenal event for veterans, members that are part of the lab school community. There were at least 150 third through ninth graders there, and they did a wonderful presentation. I enjoyed myself, and just so you all know, the youngest learners at the University of Chicago are also participating in recognizing our veterans. I'm going to take a moment to introduce the provost, Eric D. Isaacs, professor in the Department of Physics, the James Franck Institute, and the college, serves as the provost of the University of Chicago with responsibility for academic and research programs across the university. Isaacs became provost in 2014 after serving for 5 years as director of Argonne National Laboratory, one of the nation's largest science and engineering research centers, which has been managed by the university since 1946. As provost, Isaac sits on the board of governors of the University of Chicago Argonne, LLC, which manages the laboratory for the United States Department of Energy's Office of Science. He also is on the board of Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, which recently affiliated with the university. Isaac holds a PhD in physics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, wink, wink, nod, nod, and a bachelor's degree from Beloit College. He is author or co-author of more than 150 scholarly publications, most recently a paper on the impacts of advanced battery technologies on energy and the environment. It is my pleasure to introduce Eric Isaacs, Provost, University of Chicago.
Thank you very much, Fountain. I'm not sure what that little wink and nod meant, but it's good to have alumni here in the room. So first, let me start by thanking the organizing committee for putting together this event. They've done so for years, and you know, this really is a result of a group that advises my office on vets, and very much appreciate all they do. This is really a rewarding place to work for vets, and I hope that you also agree and find it that way. I also wanted to recognize Anissa Ali, who's here in the audience. Sorry, Anissa. But she's been responsible for years for putting this and organizing this very important day for us. So thank you, Anissa. I just wanted to acknowledge you. So for 125 years, and this is our 125th anniversary this year, the University of Chicago has been a place where we have been committed to rigorous inquiry. We've been committed to that idea of freedom of expression, and the knowledge produced here from that free and open inquiry really does lead to impact on our society. And none of that would be possible at all without the substantial freedoms to pursue knowledge wherever it leads, discuss questions, argue about the ideas both politely, but not so politely sometimes, and clearly openly all the time. And to take that knowledge, really to take that knowledge into action with considerable freedom that we really enjoy here. So in ensuring the very freedom that has made us who we are for these 125 years has significant costs, and one of which is borne by the men and women in the United States Armed Forces, many of you here in this room who have done that. Today's event is to celebrate all of those who have served this nation, and it is a celebration of the veterans in particular who have brought their talents here to the University of Chicago. As you can see from behind me here, veterans really have had an enormous influence on the shape of this university since its very inception. Our veterans have been presidents. They've been, of course, very significant alums. They've also been trustees, and I just name a few that you're looking at one right now, John Rogers, who happened to be one of the original 24 Tuskegee Airmen, which is a very important historical group of people in the military. Robert Maynard Hutchins, who was our 5th president. Many of you know the university system today is actually defined by Hutchins, also a veteran. Mary Jo Shelley, who is one of the first women officers in the U.S. Navy. We're all proud of all of them, and one, I'm a physicist particularly interested in, Albert Michelson, who was the first U.S. citizen to win a Nobel Prize, and it happened to be in physics. All of them veterans, all of them associated in some deep way with our university, which is really, to me, remarkable. And I should also say that we benefit every day, not just from history, but from you, your experiences in the military, bringing your sensibilities to the University of Chicago, your commitment to service, your commitment to sacrifice, your knowledge of what really counts and how to make an impact on colleagues around you and on the world you live in. All of these experiences derive from your experiences as veterans. So we really very much appreciate all you've done. Now, I personally am not a vet, but I very much am privileged to get to work with you, work for some of you, work in different ways with you, and all of us ensuring that this is a campus where vets can come, they can be students and learn, they can be faculty and teachers, they can be leaders as we see presidents of the university. So really my purpose of being here today is to introduce our speaker, who we're really privileged to have, a faculty member at the university, John Cacioppo. John is the Tiffany and Margaret Blake Distinguished Service Professor at the university. He's director of the University of Chicago Center for Cognitive and Social Neuroscience. He's got many awards. I won't read through all of them. Particularly, he's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, recipient of awards like the Society of Experimental Social Psychology's Distinguished Science Award, and on and on and on. I could stand here all afternoon just reading John's great and many recognitions. The thing about John is that he's impacted basic science in extraordinary ways around psychology and neuroscience. He established the importance of the social connections that we experience daily and through our lives in the way our bodies actually function, from regulation of the circulatory system and blood to resilience and stress to prevention of disease. His work is really remarkable, expansive, and very creative. There's one thing I wanted to highlight about his work, which I think is extremely relevant today, and why, in fact, we've invited him, which is about 5 years ago, John was approached by General Coram in the U.S. Army, who was concerned about the rate of PTSD among troops in the Army, particularly among those who have been deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan, two very difficult places for our troops. After talking to the general, John actually created a group, invited her and then a team in Chicago, and convened a group to think about resilience, about the best resilience, a group of resilience scientists to think about this problem and how we could address PTSD. And some of this work actually led and is now deployed to many thousands of men and women in the armed forces across the world. So John is a great basic science whose interest in fundamental properties of human thought, human body, human experience addresses real-world problems, and this one in particular in the military. So it's particularly fitting that we have him here today to speak. So with that, I'd like to please ask you to join me in welcoming John.
I want to add my thanks to you for coming this afternoon. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here to talk to the vets about some research that General Coram kind of talked us into getting involved with. I'd like to share that with you, and I'm going to talk about social resilience, and I'll explain what I mean by social resilience in just a moment. I want to start by noting, though, that science has made important contributions to improving our military for more than a century. Chemistry was the key science in World War II. Physics decided the outcome of World War I physics in World War II. The Cold War was heavily influenced by information technology and computer science. And the wars in the 21st century are dependent on psychological and brain sciences. This is in part because of the high tempo that characterizes the contemporary Army, the unpredictable stressors, the difficulties in differentiating friend and foe, the different rules of engagement that they're encountering, and persistent conflicts. This has led, predictably, to an increase in divorce, suicide, alcohol and substance abuse, PTSD and other mental disorders, domestic abuse, sexual assault, low mission readiness, and the attrition of leaders. This is about the point when General Coram entered my life. She came to Chicago to try to talk us into getting involved in this, and she was met by me with a great deal of skepticism. She's a convincing person. General Coram was a surgeon. During the first Iraq War, she was in a helicopter on a search and rescue mission. That helicopter was shot down. She was captured, broke legs and arms. She was one of the few to survive. Everybody else jumped on top of her before the crash because she was the highest ranking officer in the helicopter. She was tortured by the Red Guard. And at one point, they put a gun in her mouth and said, we're going to kill you. And she said, at least it will be fast. And when the gun went click and no bullet was released, she said, well, at least I'm still alive. That was the nature that she simply viewed things. And so not surprisingly, she was made the head of comprehensive soldier fitness when the Army decided, let's use psychological science to try to improve situations. And over the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen a good bit of new resilience programs released in the Army to try to improve the circumstance. What is resilience? Well, resilience is defined as the ability of a substance or material to spring back into shape. When we're talking about psychological resilience, it's the individual's ability to properly adapt to stress and adversity. As you see in this little note here, resilience people are the kind who look at a problem and immediately start looking at solutions. When they look at stressors, they look at the positive side. What is it that I can learn from? How can I avoid this in the future? Now, resilience is a very broad topic, and the focus that we've took was on social resilience. Any team is only as good as the weakest link, and know the best way to deal with that weakest link isn't to try to get that person out of the platoon. Social resilience refers to the capacity to foster, engage in, sustain positive relationships, and to endure, recover from, and grow as a result of significant stressors and isolation. Why is social resilience important in the Army? This is General Chiarelli, who was the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, and he talked about the importance in the Army of teaching our soldiers how to deal with adversity. And if you look at the circumstances of adversity, isolation and social stressors are at the very top. I met with a lot of generals. We had to get the general's permission to go on base to do the research. And I would walk in somewhat dubious that this conversation would go well because I was going to talk about social factors and something that many soldiers initially think is too soft. And I failed to ever meet a general who, as soon as I started talking, said, I'm so glad you're here. And I'm so glad you're here because I hate having these conversations with families about an adverse event, and it always has to do with something that went wrong in their social life. And so they were actually very receptive to the idea of resilience training in the social domain. The other reason I have this individual up is because he characterized in one of his talks what the average soldier looked like. And to me, I had no idea this was the case. At 24 years of age, he said, a soldier on average has moved from home, family, friends, has resided in 2 other states, has traveled the world, that is, he's been deployed, been promoted 4 times, bought a car and wrecked it, married and had children, has had relationship and financial problems, seen death, is responsible for dozens of soldiers, maintains millions of dollars worth of equipment, and gets paid less than $40,000 a year. The vets out there understand this. What's in blue are the social aspects of this individual's life. So not too surprising, as you look at the common daily stressors, and this is not my construction, this is actually General Cornum's, most of these ideas, stressors that they think were contributing to these are social in nature. Now, it's not simply a matter of having social skills. It's teaching them new ways, social cognition, new ways to think about other thinking people. One of the things we taught is how to share good times. I'll never forget the story of I was in front of a group training in this, and I said, well, how would you, to the platoon, how would you share good times? And very quickly, one of the soldiers said, well, I would rib my buddy that I beat him in PT in the run that morning. And you said, well, that's not exactly what we mean by sharing good times. You benefit from that, but at the expense of your friend. Have you ever thought of thanking that individual? Because by having a good friend who is equally good at PT, you actually get better more quickly. And so we would have to just teach them different ways of thinking about other thinking people, their colleagues in the platoon, and their families at home. Well, first question we asked is social resilience like a vaccine or an antibiotic? Is it preventive, protective, or is it curative, ameliorative? To do this, I want to tell you about the MEDAL study, and we looked there at social resilience, the consequences of deployment. The data were U.S. Army medics stationed at military installations in Europe and at Fort Hood, surveyed in person over a year or so period, 2009 to 2010. The data about which I'll tell you involved 262 medics who completed the time when measure prior to being deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan with combat arms personnel, and 383 medics who completed the time when measures after returning from deployment. Covariates, that is, things that we controlled for, were their combat experiences. So you didn't want to say something was due to social resilience when it simply reflected a combat experience or the absence of an adverse combat experience. Their social desirability, bias in their ratings, and time. We tried to use social resilience then to predict PTSD, depression, and anger-related aggressive disorders. These are some of the results. First of all, I'm not showing you the results of social resilience prior to deployment, protecting against these operations, these processes after deployment, because there were none. So in that sense, it's more like a mother's touch for the child that fell down and injured its knee. If you touch the child before they fall down, that's not all that helpful when the child falls down. If the mother is there after they fall down, that's actually protective, somewhat curative. And what we found in this study was social resilience after deployment actually diminished the PTSD, the depression, and the aggressive behavior that was seen later in those soldiers' lives. So if it has this ameliorative effect, can it be trained? Well, that we had to do a slightly different study. And we started by looking at the prior research. And there's some problems with the prior research. Resilience programs that were being distributed in the Army had been criticized because they were based on programs developed for school-age children. And they were simply adapted for Army soldiers without any research to determine whether those adaptations were appropriate. It used quasi-experimental designs, that is, soldiers weren't being randomly assigned. And without that, it's really difficult to tell whether the training is doing anything, or whether it's simply a soldier selection process. It relied on self-report measures that didn't control for various response biases, placebo effects, Hawthorne effect, expectancy effects. So you didn't know, even if there was a change, whether that reflected anything meaningful or was just a function of being surveyed. Didn't look at any potential adverse effects. Maybe this resilience training is increasing harm to the soldiers. That hadn't been examined, didn't use appropriate measures, and didn't account for the hierarchical nature of the data. The statistical models were relatively impoverished. That was useful to know because we designed the research to address all of these issues. And that was one of the things that I think General Cornum liked about our particular approach. She didn't ask for us to do this. We insisted that we do this. And we developed a training program. We first started with a theoretical model of components and processes. This is one of the things that drove General Cornum to Chicago in the first place, because we had been working in that domain. We did a meta-analysis of the interventions that had existed, and that told us something about how to change these component processes. We ran focus groups at Fort Bliss. If anyone's been deployed to Fort Bliss, you know that you're there only because you have to be. And the soldiers there were actually quite supportive and helpful in giving us feedback. The one nice thing about soldiers is they're not timid about telling you criticisms. And so we very much appreciated their contributions. We then worked through with a wonderful group of research scientists in the Army and went through 4 different iterations in various venues, often in DC, to shape that training to meet their intuitions about what would be effective. And then we ran pilot studies at JVLM in DC and Washington, and at Fort Sill in Oklahoma. And it was through those that we finally decided on the final set. So nothing like real data to hone that training. So we went through a very different process than the other resilience. This was, if you will, soldier-tested material. We also did something else. In order to address the possible confounds and biases that existed in the prior, and in order to improve the controlled randomized studies that you see as the gold standard in intervention research, we developed a new experimental design. Many surgeons don't like to use controlled randomized studies because half their patients aren't getting an effective treatment, and they're not willing to subject half their subjects who are with perhaps a life-threatening disease to a placebo treatment. In the military, from talking to various colonels and generals, they don't want half their soldiers to not get effective training. They don't want to write those letters that say your son or daughter didn't make it home. And so if we train half and we give half a placebo, they're going to train that other half while we're trying to train the first half. And so it was better for us to develop a new experimental design that avoided that problem. And we called it a double dissociative randomized control study. And it's illustrated, it's based on a process that's used in neurology, where you have two different processes and two different brain regions. And a lesion in one brain region, if it's responsible for process A, should only show the deficit in measures of that process, but not process B. Region 2, if it's in fact underlying process B, shows a deficit not for A. If you see deficits in both, then either that function isn't localized, or you're looking at something more general. It's not specific. And so what we did, and this is an example, this is a visual cortical lesion. Here's an auditory cortical lesion, visual detection, auditory detection, not too surprising. You get the specificity that would be expected, all right? So what we did was to do social resilience training and cultural awareness training. Both are social action and awareness training. So everybody in base was getting social training, social fitness training as we described it. But this was designed to increase social resilience, changes in how people thought about other people, not just social skills, but changes in how you think about them. Another problem in the Army is the soldiers' bias toward outgroup members, Afghans generally. And not all Afghans are foe. And if you attack other Afghans who are not foes, it undercuts the mission that we're trying to achieve in Afghanistan. And so the cultural awareness was designed to improve that particular problem. Two target problems, two different treatments. This should not affect social cognition toward their soldiers. This shouldn't affect outgroup bias toward Afghans. So a double dissociative randomized controlled study. We also modeled the longitudinal multi-level nature of the data, and these are just some of the levels of analysis that we used. And of course, we randomly assigned 48 platoons. We did platoons as a unit of analysis because we trained the platoons as a group. Every training session involved that, and every platoon went through 10 hours of either testing or training over a 5-day period. Just to give you an idea, I don't want to go through this slide very carefully, but we identified several component processes of social resilience, and then we had modules during each 2-hour period that we had with the platoon that we would do training in that particular module. Just to give you a feel, though, for what some of that training might have looked like, we talked about the mirror neuron system. You may not know it, but you have mirror neurons in your head. They're called mirror neurons because the neurons are active when you execute an action or when you see someone you care about execute that same action. These mirror neurons can actually contribute to your understanding of the intention of the other person. That's important both when looking at friends and when looking at foes. It also underlies mimicry, synchrony, empathy, and a variety of ways we connect at a distance. We also, just to give you another feel for it, we trained in the challenge and importance of diversity. And so this slide is based, these are exactly the slides we use, by the way. And as you can see, it recognizes that we tend to segregate into similar others, people that look and act and think like we do, believe what we believe. If anyone saw the Republican debate last night, you can see how people tend to organize by similar positions and similar beliefs. And we argue that this is actually quite detrimental. This is, I think, the secret of the University of Chicago that Eric mentioned, that we don't do this. We tend to challenge even our own ideas. In fact, perhaps more viciously than we challenge others, although we're not timid about doing that either. And through that, there's greater strength. This is not necessarily a strength of the Army. And so we trained in how diversity along every dimension can actually contribute to the improvement of the capacities of that platoon and the likelihood that they would all return in better shape. And so we use this hiring committee dilemma to illustrate that to the soldiers. So let's assume that you have 4 people trying to make a decision, and you bring together people who have special expertise, different expertise, so that you can make the best possible decision. Sounds like a committee you might put together, right? Okay, and I have here Sam and Sean. You can actually think about it as 2 different options about what one might do or the platoon might do, and it works just as well. And we all have specialized knowledge, that's why we're experts, and we have common knowledge. We're not experts about everything. We all share certain things. And let's say, these are just hypothetical, but each one of these people, you can see what they're thinking. Sam is better because of A and B, Sean is better because of C, Sam is better because of A and B, Sean D, and so on. If I look at the tally, Sam is favored in every single person's head by a majority vote, 2-1. So twice the reason to go with Sam than Sean. But it's common knowledge that's underlying that. The unique knowledge, that specialized knowledge, that is why you brought them together in the first place, or why diversity is so important in the first place, actually favors Sean by a 2-1 margin. So, of course, what tends to happen is people say what it is that's in their hair. I think Sam should be the one. And, of course, Matthew, who's sitting there, is also thinking 2-1 it's Sam, so he agrees. And we quickly come to a decision that Sam is the right choice. But if diversity is valued for diversity's sake, what you do is you get all the information out. So instead of thinking it, they're saying it. You do the tally, and of course, you come up with the opposite conclusion. And I might point out, the better conclusion. And so that's the kind of training that we would try to do with the Army, so they could see on paper, right in front of them, why it was important to have diversity, to put up with dissimilarities and then find broader similarities and mission achievement. They all got a graphic card behind, and they were encouraged to practice afterwards, and we actually followed up to see how that worked. And the answer is some platoons were better than other platoons. I'll never forget, one master sergeant contacted us afterwards and said, I went home after the training and I started doing some of this in my home, and my wife said, what did they do to you? Why didn't they do this sooner? And so that was a master sergeant who not only was training himself, but continued to train his platoon. It wasn't the rule, but it was seen in some cases. Cultural awareness training, quite different, much more fact-based. I was shocked to learn many of the soldiers who had been deployed to Afghanistan really hadn't seen a map of all of Afghanistan. They had seen only mission-relevant material. These materials, by the way, are readily available in the Army, but the soldiers hadn't availed themselves to that. So we taught them about geography, religions, culture, activities, differences in ethnicity, and this was something that came as a big shock to the soldiers, that there were so many differences and that these ethnicities themselves had very different customs, didn't always get along. It wasn't just in Afghanistan, throughout the Middle East. And so it was very fact-based training. And they too were left with the same kind of material. So both groups were treated very similarly in every regard. This is just to show you kind of the overall design, 48 platoons, randomized by platoons, pre-test, training, post-test, and then the analysis. And the numbers winnowed down a little bit because we identified soldiers who were not completing all of the answers, who answered but were answering by straight lining or Christmas tree responding. That is, they were just filling out the forms, they weren't reading the questions. We excluded those soldiers, and not everyone consented to approve their data for analysis, and of course we restricted that and didn't analyze their data. So of those soldiers that we did analyze, this is the first point of results, and these are significant, so I want you to look at this. Effect size, social resilience training actually changed how soldiers thought about other soldiers. These are some of the specific ways in which we changed. I'll just point out the first three. The overall reflects the average effect size. It's 0.21, that's called the small to moderate effect size. But if you look at the effect of aspirin on reduced heart attacks in those who've already had a heart attack, the effect size is 0.06. So a 0.21 is a small effect size, but actually quite significant when looking at large numbers of people. Their beliefs, their empathy, their perspective taking, and on are among the largest. So they really were thinking differently about other soldiers. Okay, what about cultural awareness training? Well, you see here we have even bigger effect sizes, but most of that's driven by the knowledge per se. They spent 10 hours learning facts about Afghanistan, and they knew nothing about, or very little about Afghanistan to start with, so there was a huge improvement in knowledge about Afghanistan. Now, what I'm showing you are effect sizes for that interaction. So remember our double dissociative design? These are the improvements seen uniquely in this group and not in the other group. And you see the one that we really cared most about, this outgroup prejudice going down, we were successful effect size about 0.6. That's a moderate to large effect size. We looked at potential adverse effects. This is the list of effects that we looked for, and none of them even approached statistical significance. So not too surprisingly, in fact, the direction of this was beneficial in every case. Not significant, but we were doing no harm, which had been expressed as a concern. So in terms of the possible problems with prior research, we addressed all of them and found the research wasn't subject to those criticisms. We went beyond that, though. When I tell you the training was effective, you can think about medical treatments or any other kind of treatment. It's effective, but it's not effective for everyone. And I wanted to know, for whom is it not effective? And that was important for two reasons. That would tell us, theoretically, what might be the problems and how can we benefit. Use those individual differences as a theoretical tool to identify where the component process is not being implemented or not being changed, and how can we change it? Where does the theory make the wrong prediction, and how do we have to improve it? Right? So that was one reason. The other reason was we didn't want to leave any soldiers behind. If we're only helping the healthiest, that's not as encouraging as if we can help all the soldiers. So we could actually improve efficacy for the Army. And what you see here is one particular social component, organizational behaviors. And you see this is a social resilience, this is a cultural awareness training. This, obviously, this factor, openness of their personality, wasn't changing whether cultural awareness training was successful. It did change. It did moderate whether social resilience training was effective. Social resilience training requires that you change how you think about other people. Other people you already have very strong opinions about. Those who were open-minded showed much bigger changes than those who were very close-minded. And that's what these data are showing. Not only did personality matter, situations mattered. Those of you who have been deployed may understand this really quickly. So cultural awareness, no effects. Social resilience, those who had been deployed previously benefited, but not nearly as much as those who had never been deployed. Being deployment adds to your skepticism, adds to your just saltiness. And they were much less willing to take a different view of their platoon members, new and old, than were those who had never been deployed. So one of the things that we told the Army was it looks like social resilience appears to be more ameliorative, like an antibiotic, than protective, like a vaccine. Social resilience can be trained, and if you're going to use it effectively, it's analogous to physical resilience. It's most effective when training is early and often. And I'd like to end with an acknowledgement of those who made major contributions to this research. You'll see a number of colonels and generals in this list, and lieutenant colonels. But I'd like to in particular point out Lieutenant Colonel David Cabrera. David was responsible for the medic metal study, and he was killed in Afghanistan by an IED on a side road in Kabul. It drove home to us, and I think I wanted to share this with you, just how grateful we are and should be to our vets. Not all vets make it back, and your sacrifices and risks allow us to express free thought at places like the University of Chicago, and I, for one, am extraordinarily grateful to you. So thank you.
It's a nice picture. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Wake, and I am the new Assistant Provost and Director of the Office for Equal Opportunity Programs. I want to thank you very, very deeply for taking the time to be here today. I have the pleasure of getting to stand in front of you and thank you, which gives the false impression that I was somehow responsible for planning this event. This was truly a group effort, so I'd like to take just a minute to thank those who contributed to today. So first, thank you to our presenter, who I can't see, Professor Cacioppo, for an engaging and thoughtful presentation. My favorite thing about working at the university is that I'm reminded every day that I'm surrounded by people way smarter than me, and today was no exception, so thank you very much. Second, thank you to our provost, Eric Isaacs, for his warm welcome and for his overall support of my office and the work that we're doing every day. He's a true advocate, excuse me, and I'm grateful for his support. As Eric mentioned earlier, we have Veterans Outreach Committee here, and I'd like to ask them to stand and be recognized. If you could, please. I will point you out if you don't. So please stand. Thank you so much. Can we give them a round of applause? This group is comprised of representatives from across the university, many of whom are veterans, and they do an outstanding job, not just with today's presentation, but with thinking more broadly about how we can best serve the veterans in our community. So thank you for your work. A special thank you to the executive assistant in my office, Mitchell Kitlaus, who's giving me a dirty look. This is Mitchell's 5th year taking the lead on planning this event, and he did a really, really tremendous job, so thank you, Mitchell. And thank you to Denise Jorgens, Mary Beth DiStefano, Michelle Lopolo of International House for their hospitality, and to Nick Gattozzi of University Events and Ceremonies for their help as well. And thank you to our Chief of Police, Fountain Walker, for his remarks and for his service on the Outreach Committee. Fountain is a Marine, and so to him and all of the Marines here, happy belated 240th birthday. It was their 240th birthday yesterday. You look good for 240, Fountain. You do, yeah. Finally, and most importantly, thank you so much to the veterans who are here today. You enrich the university community, the Chicago community, and our country in ways that I can never thank you enough for. I am committed to enhancing outreach and education efforts for our veterans, so if any of you would like to speak to me about how we can best do that, I would welcome the opportunity to meet with you and speak to you anytime. Thank you again for attending today. It was a pleasure to be here with you.